Good morning, Charisse. How's it going?
Morning.
How are things in Japan?
It's great. I have much better weather than Hong Kong.
Oh yeah, it was
Significantly better.
pretty bad. Well, it hasn't been that bad. Honestly, nothing that isn't manageable, but it's been tough getting around.
That T8.
It's been tough getting around. Maybe you can tell people where you're at right now.
Okay, I'm at Ishigaki, Japan, which is actually only a 55-minute plane ride from Taipei. So I'm much closer to Taiwan than I am to the main island of Japan. And the feels here are basically Hawaii.
So this is the second episode of MAEKAN It Up. How did you feel about the first episode?
I actually wound up listening to the whole thing. And after getting over the awkwardness of the sound of my voice, I was pretty pleased.
Yeah, I mean,
I thought we had good rapport.
for a first one, it was pretty good. But yeah, the part that I really enjoyed was to seeing your illustration after the fact. And I'm sure I could say the same thing about you.
No, I'm excited to see what you come up with for this one.
I'm actually the one cheating this week. I didn't want to use that same graded paper as last week, so I'm using an iPad Pro with a pen. Yeah, what are you using today?
I am using a Muji pen and a Moleskine, so we're going full hipster.
Maybe we can dive right into things. I mean, I don't want to keep you away from your family because you're probably going to have a wealth of activities planned, given your weather's so much better than ours.
It's going to be snorkeling today.
Oh, that sounds fun. That sounds really good.
Yeah.
So maybe we can jump into the first topic, which is a discussion about the Skim. So the Skim, if you're not familiar, it's a female-centric newsletter that has a lot of subscribers. I think there's over 1 million subscribers, and the whole premise behind the newsletter is basically taking world news or just relevant news topics and simplifying it and introducing a liberal dose of pop culture. And, recently there was, I guess there's these two schools of thoughts that emerged where one side, courtesy of this writer for Slate, Christina Cauterucci, I'm pretty sure I screwed up that name. She was going off about how the Skim is the Ivanka Trump of newsletters, where it's basically supporting the fact that news can be simple and you can be overtly basic in how you present it. On the other hand, people are arguing that, courtesy of a writer for the Columbia Journalism Review, Kaylin, another name that is very difficult to pronounce, Kaylin Ugulik, was saying at the end of the day, you're putting these topics in front of people that might not necessarily be looking for insight into this. So it's, once again, I'm pretty sure I used this term last week. It's like things that are net positive. And the fact you're actually bringing this to light is better than not highlighting it at all, even if it's a bit basic, even if it's maybe reducing the severity or seriousness of something by pairing a topic with, I don't know, a Justin Bieber lyric. So what are your thoughts on how news should be presented, Charisse? Like, do you feel that there is room for something that's fun and light-hearted when it comes to news? Well, maybe first off, do you read the Skim?
So I used to read the Skim. I used to be a subscriber, and then this makes me even worse than the Ivanka Trumps of newsletters, is that I couldn't keep up with it. Because it's a daily newsletter that is, I would say, like a 10-minute read, maybe. And it is actually, in my defense of the Skim, it's actually quite dense because, sure, maybe some of the times they introduce a news topic is with a pop culture reference, but they always link out to other articles. So if you were to seriously read the Skim, you'd be devoting maybe half an hour to reading hard news on subjects that aren't easy to understand. So that's me and the Skim. In preparation for this, I did go back to read a couple of recent issues. And I don't know if this is in response to the Slate's criticism, but I didn't find a single shallow martini-based metaphor.
I subscribed quite a while ago, and I never read it. But the reason is that those references I feel detract from the actual topic at hand, and it almost reduces the actual importance of something.
Why do you think it reduces the topic at hand?
Because I think that you have to find a way to create relevance for it by injecting pop culture, as opposed.
How do you consume your news?
I consume my news through RSS, through newsletters, not really social media, because honestly, for whatever reason, I mean, Twitter is probably the most intellectually rooted sort of news discovery I have, but it's not like I'm going to Facebook for news.
What's the most skim-like product that you follow? Is there one that's like an aggregate?
There's kind of the male version of the skim called The Hustle that I just started following out of, I almost like market research to see how they do it. But even then, like creating the flow and the kind of the narrative is much more impactful than catching me with, a pop culture reference. And I think that's the thing, is that people, for me personally, it's not that you can't word it in a way that is a little bit more lighthearted, but do you need to reference something from pop culture in regards to getting someone's attention? Or can we start building a base of knowledge where, hey, you know what? Let's lead with the fact of why this is important or why this is impactful, versus, hey, you know what? What's the meme of the week? Let me latch onto that as the vehicle. I see a lot of parallels from what we talked about last week, where it's like, at the end of the day, you're using like this thing where it's almost like a Trojan horse, where you're going to use pop culture as a Trojan horse. And then once you let it into your life, you start to wrap your head around it, then the real message unveils itself. Personally, I think it can be successful. I just don't like it. I just think that it, there's obviously different ways you're going to look on how you're going to educate someone on a topic. But, I generally find defining the importance of something through the writing and setting up the argument versus, what's the lowest common denominator?
I have two responses. One is, I don't think the skim is as shallow as you're describing. I don't know if it's improved since when you were a regular reader, but in my research, I really did not find it to be as weak as the Slate was describing, and as I feel like you are currently describing. And my second response is that something that I do follow regularly are those satirical news shows like The Tonight Show, Late Night with Seth Meyers, Last Week Tonight. So all three of these shows cover the news, right? But they do it in a way that's humorous, and they are very popular, right? Seth Meyers, Trevor Noah, John Oliver. I feel like
John Oliver, I've watched.
Right. So you at least are aware of these people, and they have a big viewership. I was not doing research and watching an episode of one of these shows, and I was struck by how much of this baiting that they do, that we've been describing that the skim does. This baiting where they're like, hey, the news is hard to understand. Let me use a joke to set up this difficult topic for you. So I kind of feel like if the skim gets hate, then these shows should get hate too, because they do the same thing. And maybe they all do they all justly deserve it.
I mean, there is no really right or wrong answer. It's on the basis of the medium. I think TV needs to set itself up in a certain way, especially by virtue of you having more limited time. You can't mess around. But to that argument, John Oliver, I think, has a sense of the facial reactions. Everything is done to, as you said, set something up. And I don't always agree with that either. I think there is part of that I just want a little bit more rigor, and I want people to potentially focus on things from a more functional point of view rather than entertainment, because I feel everything is overtly driven by entertainment. Like the skim is all those references create an entertainment product that personally, philosophically, I don't always agree with. And I think that's where my friction with this, if I was to look at the Slate versus Columbia Journalism Review, I'm definitely on the Slate side. So I think that it's coming down to that point where, hey, can you start to push people to understand, the importance of something versus, hey, you know what? Let's sugarcoat the topic. But then again, that's the thing is, I kind of see now I'm weakening my argument, but I know for a fact there's certain people that need a stepping stone into deeper narratives, deeper news, whatever it may be. And I guess that's the part, like maybe it's just my part within my current, news consumption habit that doesn't allow me to get behind something like the Skim. Whereas if I was 10 years younger and I was just trying to find a more approachable way, then yeah, of course, then maybe that's what it is. But then that sort of leads us to the next thing is like, I didn't need the Skim or a Skim-like product to understand the relevance and importance of understanding the news as is. So like, what does that set someone up for if like you never graduate past the Skim and this becomes your de facto news source? Although to that point, I mean, people are arguing that it's not meant to be your only news source, just like Facebook isn't your only news source.
I think you are a more advanced news consumer. I think, we've been talking about, both of the articles sort of refer to this target demographic of working women who are somehow too busy for the news, but have time for social engagements. But what about like young women who are maybe 16 through 22 who are just figuring out like there's a bigger world out there? Like, couldn't this also be a product for them? And if you think about it that way, like it seems quite beneficial. Like they needed a stepping stone.
Yeah, that's totally valid. It's just what is the progression of that? There's definitely publications that exist that are fulfilling, especially on the news front, that whole range of editorial products.
I think in a way as well that the MAEKAN briefing that we do, we think of it, I know that you are, I guess, slightly anti-Skim from what you've been expressing, but I think the MAEKAN briefing is a little bit like the Skim in the idea that we are trying to be a starting point for people to learn more about culture on their own.
Yeah, I would 100% agree. And, to that point, I think the challenge as of late has been, what is the proper balance? Like, this is an interesting thing because like over the course of the last few weeks, anytime something comes up and we have to discuss the direction of something, I need to remove myself from the discussion because I'm not a prototypical user. As I mentioned, Alex is my product market fit guy. Like if you put something in front of him and he can soon become the barometer of whether it has sort of a larger audience. Whereas for me, I think I'm pretty narrow-minded in the things I like and don't like. Full stop.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to argue with that one. I agree with you.
And I'm really bad at drawing and talking at the same time.
So we mentioned the briefing, and something that you put in it was the Google project We Wear Culture. And what this is that Google teamed up with different fashion institutes and museums in 40 different countries around the world to create this mega database of textiles, clothing, art related to clothing, historical documents regarding fashion designers, and they've put all of this online. There are a couple of innovative ways to sort through it based off of time or color, and they've also created some VR videos that go through stories such as how Coco Chanel designed the first little black dress.
Yeah, I thought...
So my question for you... Oh, go for it.
No, I was going to say, I thought the whole project was eye-opening for me on the basis that I think I think we're at a point currently where there's a lot of subcultural stuff that is at risk of being lost because you're not properly cataloging it. And this is definitely a step in the right direction. I can only imagine there's a lot of shitty Angel Fire, GeoCity sites that have already been lost that kind of had this back catalog of amazing stories and history that for, lack of upkeep, they're no longer there. But so like Google taking the initiative to do this, I think is really, really important.
So what do you think is the value of having this database?
Prior to MAEKAN, I spent a lot of time in quote unquote fashion. And, I think I became really jaded. I stopped really understanding the value of fashion and why it was so important. But now I look back on it and, being quote unquote out of the game, it's like fashion in itself has such an important role in helping define identity. And that to me is something that's incredibly important, because we're always seeking identity as humans. Like, who do we identify with? How do people perceive us? All these things. And while the intangible element of our thoughts and how we think are how a lot of people want to be perceived, before you can get to that point, you really need to have an initial reference point. And I think fashion is what provides that reference point. And I mean, I came across this interview where they talked about, tech and wearables, and the reason why tech companies struggle to create something fashionable is because their inability to understand kind of the psychological and cultural context of fashion. So you kind of need to have a pulse on fashion and culture to know, like, hey, you know what? For 2017, this is what's popular, and it's popular for this reason, and this is how I'm going to communicate physically those emotions and those thoughts. Like, I know for you, Charisse, you've never been necessarily massively into fashion. Like, what role does fashion play in culture?
I think it is interesting how fashion can categorize you as one thing or another. You've talked about how fashion is a kind of self-expression, a creation of your own identity. But I am interested, I think, from an anthropological point of view, how fashion can cause someone from the outside to look at a group of people and to group them together, whether that person wants to be part of that group or not, right? So we quickly make distinctions on the backgrounds of people based off of the clothes that they wear. And, like that really worn out phrase of dress for the job you want. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to think of how clothing can become a costume for people, or like a way for you to try and be something that you're not, if that was what your aim was. Mm-hmm. So I think that's quite interesting. I guess I'm thinking of it more as a historical vantage point, because I feel like this Google project is very much about, like you were saying, like a catalog, right? It's something that would be a treasure trove for historians to look at and to see how maybe key figures in time were able to change culture, change groups because of the way they dressed.
That to me is really interesting, especially this day and age where right around 2009 is when we saw people really starting to adopt this sort of this popular internet form of dress. And when I say that, I mean people started dressing the same. Everything became a bit more accessible in all major cities. Online shopping took off. So you started to see this sort of heterogeneous approach to fashion, where we need to kind of represent regionally how we look and feel, our music subculture. That sort of went away when everyone had access to generally the same things. And that to me is a little bit unfortunate. One of the major things that still has a bit of identity to it, I think, is weather and temperature-based fashion, because those are things that you can't transport, right? Like sneakers can be something that you could drop in any part of the world, but when it comes to like a big winter jacket, that's still the one frontier that, that person in Canada is going to understand, but that person in Mexico City, like that's the one incompatibility. But aside from that, everything's sort of the same. And where will fashion be in the next 10, 20, 30 years? And I'm pretty pessimistic about it, because we've started to move past fashion in several capacities, where it's, first off, an upcoming generation is more in tune with experiences than they are with actual tangible products. Secondly, I just think that there's a certain openness to just being part of a movement, as opposed to defining your own sense of fashion. So it's like, what's popular now? Okay, that becomes my de facto uniform, as opposed to like back in the day, I personally felt that, it was almost embarrassing. And this is just me speaking from my youth. If I rolled up to like an event or a party and someone else was dressed like me, that was immediately a sense of embarrassment, because you kind of fell in.
You have talked about this.
I have talked about it.
You have talked about how you feel like it's so weird that people can now rock up to a place wearing Yeezys and see like 5 other people wearing Yeezys and find it totally cool.
Did you have a chance to play around with the actual layout and all that stuff?
I did. And I had a question so it was fun. Like I played around with going through color and time and looking at hats specifically, or at, what was it? Different accessories. They sort things by different articles of clothing. But I was wondering, do you think that this is useful currently?
In what capacity?
Well, like I see its value as a database, and someone needs to do this work, right? It's a lot of work to gather all this material and take good photographs. But where does it become useful to a current day internet user? Like, why would someone just go and browse this?
I think that it would definitely put some people onto things that they probably weren't familiar with. I mean, I especially look at the ones that date back to subcultures. I think subcultures are incredibly powerful because I think currently we don't have that same level of subcultural intersection for fashion where, you know, this music genre equates to this style of fashion. Because now it's the cost of entry is literally just buying it. Whereas back in the day, I think there was a sense of actual acquisition and earning that had to come with being a participant. Now there is the participation and kind of having skin in the game is very minor. So now you're kind of see like these sort of pockets of subculture being defined by fashion. And that's the thing is like, you know, it was always, like came to like skateboarding. People were always very vocal about people dressing like they skated when they never skated. And that to me personally has kind of gone away, and it kind of held people to being authentic, which now it's okay to not be authentic. And obviously me being the sort of like extremist that I am in the sense of authenticity, it's like either you're in or you're not, you know, like I'm not a big fan of wearing basketball shoes and never play basketball. Right. And do I?
So can I wear Vans even though I don't skate?
Man, this becomes a whole other topic because I don't think Vans is necessarily a skate company. And I don't think they personally want to present themselves as a skate company.
Okay. I had one more question about this Google project before we move past it. How do you think this benefits Google?
Google needs to be seen as more than, and you know, I'm not saying this is their only instance of doing it, but for me, Google needs to be seen as like an omnipresent brand in your life. It's someone that doesn't just do search. It's someone that is going to infiltrate, for better or worse, all parts of your life. And this to me is like, Google is, how do I put it? It's creating these pathways through culture, you know, whether it's language. I think that's one of the most interesting parts is Google's ability to work with language, you know, Google Translate, how they're improving that. But, you know, like I said, fashion, what makes fashion so powerful is the fact it's tangible. It's like you look at fashion and there is no guesswork. You see it, you understand how it's worn, and I mean, through sites like the one they've created, the project they've created, you understand the context behind it. Whereas like certain things like language, I can explain it to you, but I don't think it has the same impact because it doesn't have that same ability to visually impact you.
I think it is an interesting foreshadowing of the future where, like you're saying, Google wants to be omnipresent, and Google moves from being just this, they're already so much more than a search engine, but also more than something that's in your screen.
Yeah, no, totally. And, you know, I think that's what everyone wants to do. They just want a greater share of your attention. And projects like this aren't going to define Google in the sense of like, this is going to be a new massive revenue stream. But I think it's continually building the brand for them. That goes beyond whatever, you know, phones, search. So maybe let's move on to the next topic, which pertains to Wonder Woman. So I actually didn't watch the movie, but a lot of people in the office watched it, and it kind of raised some interesting thoughts about the movie itself in terms of what it represents. How does Wonder Woman, by virtue of being one of the most popular, well, I think in the last 2 weeks it's been the #1 box office movie. So maybe you can give in a short summary or description without revealing too much of the plot line. Does that make it hard? Probably.
No. I was just wondering if this is only our second podcast, but if there's going to be a spoiler warning, this is where it would go. If you're the sort of person who wants to know nothing about a movie before watching it, like the next 5 minutes are not for you. Wonder Woman, which I have seen, is based off of the comics. And it's sort of the first superhero movie that features a strong female superhero and was also very successful because the previous ones were, I think, Elektra and Catwoman, which were not at all hits. So, Eugene, you didn't watch it. So everything you have is like heard by other people.
Yeah, all my
What is the thing what have you been hearing from other folks?
So this was by virtue of Cody. He was saying that he wasn't, I think that there's a sense of confidence in the fact that now people are opening up to strong female leads, but there's something about it that came up short. You know, there's something about the whole way that it was presented that maybe wasn't able to fully push the message. And although I think Cody was still trying to figure out in the right words how to describe his perspective, he just felt that like there was so much more they could have done in terms of like pushing a certain narrative. And this is sort of his objective point of view. Like, did you come away from that movie with a sense of, hey, this is actually pushing, you know, female equality forward in Hollywood, in the entertainment industry? Or was it simply just, hey, you know what? This is pure entertainment. And I think it's gender agnostic. Like, it doesn't matter whether it was Wonder Woman or whoever else. It was just a good movie.
So I discussed this with my sister, who also watched it. And she feels that expecting a movie, any movie, to be this big catalyst for feminism, like to change someone's mind, is a lot of pressure to put on something that's for entertainment. So that was her stance on it. And I argued that I think what is exciting to me as a woman is just fair representation in Hollywood. Just not even the plot, but the fact that we can have a successful blockbuster that has a strong female lead and she gets most of the screen time and all of the action scenes is already exciting. So I don't know. Is it because I'm female and so my bar is lower than Cody's, where I'm like, the fact that they even made this movie is a win.
Yeah,
and
maybe.
So even though they could have done more, like, I will take what we can get.
Do you think that now that this has set the bar for something, that your next expectation is going to be higher?
I think so. I am not displeased with the Wonder Woman movie. I felt they did not fall into any traps where the men help Diana and it's not really her fighting and it's the men. You know, they didn't do that. Like, they did a good job of it being really Diana goes on her self-discovery. She does all the like hard work. She's an independent, strong warrior, right? So good job. If I assume there are going to be more movies with her. As they continue, I think it would be about developing a more complex narrative.
And you say that on the basis of complex being more intertwined with gender commentary, or more complex in the sense that it's just not so basic, like, hey, saving the world?
I would hope for both. I think the plot of this is pretty basic. The plot is very much, save the world. Yeah. I would love for some subtle commentary on modern society, but, in a way they don't have to do that, because a superhero movie is like a period piece, right? Like, it takes place in this fictional fantasy world. So they don't have to try to make it comment on what's happening in real life, but it would be nice if they did.
Do you think by virtue of the fact that Wonder Woman is superhero based, it's why it was so popular? Like, will we ever see anything outside of the superhero realm that has a strong female lead that dominates the screen time that can have the same success? Or do we need to really just start with that lowest common denominator of, because obviously superhero movies are extremely popular. That's kind of your entry point. Yeah. And whether it can actually scale up is to be seen. Yeah,
I think it's a little bit sad because superhero movies are incredibly popular regardless of the superhero. So that they were able to capture a much wider audience by it being a superhero movie. Like if they had done, something based off of a real, as in like an actual historical feminist character, I don't think it would have even gotten as many crowds, right?
Yeah. Have you watched Orange is the New Black? I bring that up because my wife watches it pretty frequently. Like it's one of her favorite shows, I'd say. And what's interesting about it, I was like, oh, like, someone that's a casual viewer, I'm like, do you think this has a lot of longevity to it? And she was saying, like, actually, there's so many complex things they're talking about. And for anyone that doesn't watch Orange is the New Black, it's about female incarceration. And the way that they've set it up, it touches on so many relevant societal topics that perhaps there's so much opportunity for them to explore, whether it's, sexuality, it's about race, it's all these kind of deeper topics that often probably aren't really spoken about in mainstream media. Well, sorry, let me rephrase that. It's not that they're not spoken about. It's not that they're done through an avenue like a TV show in such a real format. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that I find interesting is that I think more than ever that even though these topics exist, there's now more and more platforms, especially on a Netflix, where you're not necessarily held to advertisers. You're just really held to creating great content. It enables you to truly push the boundaries. And at the end of the day, like, I'm not being sold anything. I just need to make sure that you as Netflix are creating compelling moments that are going to make sure that I continue subscribing every month. Now that's to me a lot more fascinating. Maybe movies and Hollywood are not where we can expect the biggest advancements in equality, whether it's racial equality in entertainment or even gender equality. Not even, but just gender equality in general.
Right. I think that's fair. I think we can't really expect a 1.5 to 2 hour movie to get into too much nuance. I still think what I said earlier is, what makes me most pleased about Wonder Woman is that girls and even people like my age, right? Like mid-20s, is that we can see women fighting on screen. Like that doesn't really happen, right? Like you don't really get a whole battle scene because there's this scene on the beach where it's all these female warriors. Men get to see men shooting other men all the time, right? Yeah. So it's just nice that we got to see that.
Yeah.
But you brought up Orange is the New Black, which brings us perfectly to our last topic regarding the Liechtenstein piece that was sold in order to start that criminal justice fund.
That was mind-blowing to me on the basis that it was just sort of, the way it was so casually revealed, and I think that I haven't checked since I first came across it and whether it's sort of made itself known across the internet, but that honestly is massive news in my eyes. I'm honestly not that familiar with the whole intersection of art collection and philanthropy, but I think that by virtue of having something like that happen, that is incredibly impactful.
Sure thing. So Agnes Gund, who is a art collector, sold her Liechtenstein masterpiece for $165 million to another art collector. And that $100 million of that money was used to start a Art for Justice fund. And the focus of this fund is to bring criminal justice in the States. I think that's about it. The reason I mentioned it in connection with Orange is the New Black is, interestingly enough, they are having a kind of fundraiser gala conference, and one of the speakers is the woman that TV show is based off of.
Oh, nice. Yeah, and I guess my biggest takeaway was Agnes, she has done a great job, I think, of putting collectors in the spotlight, because collectors of a high level are obviously very affluent people. And when that Keith Haring was sold very recently to the guy that started, I want to say Zozotown. I was just looking at his like Instagram, and you could see like people were like, oh, amazing. And then on the other side, people were like, you spent that much money, and there's, this is always a de facto argument. Oh, so many people are suffering and you're spending this money on art. So this is kind of a call to arms for these types of people to actually make a difference.
Yeah.
This is something I definitely need to look more into, but there is this sort of backhanded nature to affluent people that are trying to make a difference through donations and through putting up fortunes and all that stuff that I don't fully comprehend. And I need to look past the superficial feel-good layer of, hey, you know what? Bill Gates is donating XYZ of his fortune.
We talked about this actually just in the last podcast. So it seems like, this is almost a theme for us, which is the branding behind why things are done and whether it really matters. Because there's no way we can argue this is definitely net positive, right? Like whatever it does to further Agnes personally or the MoMA or art collectors, we can't argue that it's net positive.
This is something maybe we should do some research for upcoming discussions, because net positive seems to be just the thing that guides us. And is it overly basic to just be like, hey, you know what? Net positive is good enough? Or is there a way to like optimize and to like start stripping away certain elements to ensure that you're not just a little bit net positive, but, by virtue of pursuing this but not that, you could far exceed just an incremental change.
Right. So I guess the question is, beyond this being a good thing, how can someone do this better via someone doing this worse? And someone doing this, I mean, someone who tries to further some kind of charitable cause while also simultaneously furthering their personal agenda.
I mean, I feel, I don't like saying this, but I always question when there's a lot of money put up on the table, like, what are the motives behind something? And I want to personally think that there's no motive aside from what you see. If Agnes is going to start a fund, it's weird for me to reference her by first name because I don't know her, but if
Agnes Gund,
if Agnes Gund is
Ms. Gund,
if Miss Gund is going to go and throw up, $100 million, I want it to be seen as $100 million towards the support of this cause. Whereas, I remember when things were reviewed after the fact for, there's certain things that once you start peeling away the layers, you kind of understand the true motives and intentions. And I think that's like our duty to honestly do their due diligence and to make sure that things are kind of properly understood in that capacity.
I did have a little bit of this skepticism that you have when I first heard about this news, like, oh, it's just another one of those sort of attention-getting actions. Not to say that I don't know anything about Ms. Gunn's background, but just the nature of the story made me think that. However, what helped me believe in this particular initiative is because it has the support of Brian Stevenson. Are you familiar?
No.
He started the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama, and he's written this really good book that you should read called Just Mercy.
Oh, so you've read it before.
And yes. So I've read this, I think even like 2 years ago, and was widely recommending it to everyone at that time. And Just Mercy covers Stevenson's beginning this initiative, the Equal Justice Initiative. And what they do is try to get wrongfully incarcerated prisoners out of jail.
That to you is a great cosign.
Yes, that was the best cosign Ms. Gunn could have gotten, at least in my perspective, because many people already knew Stevenson as a advocate for this cause, for criminal justice, and the fact that he's quoted in the New York Times article and he supports what she's doing is...
I'm glad you brought that up, because like I said, I was never dismissive of this whole thing, but until I get more and more information to build up a solid case that it's not just a promotional play.
Yeah, I guess that is one way we can start judging whether, the Zuckerbergs and Bill Gates of the world are doing the right thing, is because there are no-name people who have been working in the causes that they want to support, right? Like, I mean no name by like not famous people. And if the Zuckerbergs and the Gates try to partner with these people, then it seems to make their intentions more obvious.
Yeah. And that to me is probably the one thing that having high level people hold each other accountable for things, I think is critical.
Would you ever start, or would you, I shouldn't say it that way. I was just trying to think of what the equivalent would be for like people in our industry. And I guess it's like the people we're around collect clothes and toys and sneakers and other products. And it would be like reselling those things for some kind of good cause.
Yeah, I think that's something that would definitely be, I mean, there's a lot of, people collect a lot of stuff, you know, sneakers, clothes, electronics, and finding a way to generate support around that would be really interesting. But arguably, the world of art collecting and the world of sneaker collecting, they're miles away in terms of how lucrative one and the other can be. Not to say sneakers can't be lucrative, but you're looking at one piece of art that moved for 165 million.
Yeah.
Right? I think,
how many sneakers do you have to sell?
I mean, I don't know if one singular collection could ever get to those levels. I think that's a good place to end it. I'm going to let you get back to snorkeling and hang out with your family. I'm going to get ready to go to the office, look out the window and lament how gloomy it is and how rainy it is. I'm Eugene.
I'm Charisse.
And this is Making It Up.